Windsor Castle had survived 9 centuries of siege, civil war, and German bombing. Its walls had sheltered 39 monarchs. Its rooms held paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Leonardo da Vinci. But on the 20th of November, 1992, a single curtain caught fire, and within 15 hours, 1/5 of the oldest inhabited castle on Earth was gone. That was not the crisis. The crisis came 3 days later, when the British government told a recession-battered nation that taxpayers would foot the £37 million repair bill for a queen who had not paid income tax in 60 years. The fortress did not fall to flames. It nearly fell to a receipt. Chapter 1. A Conqueror Builds His Insurance Policy. William the Conqueror did not build Windsor Castle because he loved the view of the Thames. He built it because he did not trust the country he had just stolen. It was 1066. Harold Godwinson was dead at Hastings. England was conquered but not controlled. William understood something that every occupier learns. A battle can be won in an afternoon, but a country takes decades to hold. He needed a chain of fortifications ringing London, not to keep foreign enemies out, to keep the English in. He chose a chalk bluff above the Thames, roughly 20 miles west of London and a day's march from the tower he was building to the east. The site was already elevated, 60 feet above the river, giving any garrison a commanding view of the valley and the ancient road from London to the west. William's masons did not build in stone. They built in timber. Speed mattered more than beauty. A Motte and Bailey castle went up within weeks. Wooden palisades, a ditch, a watchtower. It was not a palace, it was a statement of force. For the next century, Windsor remained a military installation. Henry I was the first monarch to actually live there, drawn by the hunting grounds of the surrounding forest. But the real transformation came under Henry III and then Edward III in the 1300s. Edward spent over £50,000 on Windsor, a sum equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the English crown. He created the College of St. George and the Order of the Garter, turning a frontier fortress into the ceremonial heart of English kingship. The round tower rose above the original motte. The upper ward took shape as a royal residence. Stone replaced timber. Permanence replaced expedience. Over the centuries that followed, each monarch layered ambition onto the building. Charles II, returning from exile in France, spent nearly £300,000 trying to make Windsor rival Versailles. He hired the architect Hugh May and the painter Antonio Verrio, who covered ceilings with mythological scenes designed to suggest that the Stuarts ruled by divine right. George III made Windsor his primary home and poured money into the castle's interior. George IV, never a man to be restrained by a budget, hired the architect Geoffrey Wyatville and spent over £1 million on a Gothic transformation so total that the medieval castle nearly vanished beneath 19th century stonework. By the dawn of the 20th century, Windsor Castle had become something its Norman builders could never have imagined. It was not merely a royal residence, it was a stage set for empire. State banquets hosted foreign heads of state beneath ceilings painted with the victories of British arms. The Waterloo Chamber, built to celebrate Wellington's defeat of Napoleon, held a table that could seat 150. The grand reception room glittered with gilded paneling rescued from a demolished French palace. The walls held works by Holbein, Canaletto, Rubens, and Van Dyck. By 1992, the castle sprawled across 13 acres. It contained roughly 1,000 rooms including 227 bedrooms and 300 fireplaces. The round tower dominated the skyline of the Berkshire countryside. The Royal Library in the upper ward housed Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical drawings, 600 sheets of the finest draftsmanship in the history of art. The castle was the oldest continuously inhabited royal residence in the world, and its sheer accumulation of treasure, architecture, and ceremony made it irreplaceable in a way that no insurance policy could quantify. But irreplaceable is not the same as indestructible. And the deeper truth about Windsor Castle, the truth that 9 centuries of grandeur had made easy to forget, was that a building designed to withstand siege had never been designed to withstand fire. The very features that made it magnificent, its oak timbers, its concealed roof voids, its miles of corridors, also made it a catastrophe waiting for a spark. The spark would come. But the fire, as devastating as it was, would prove to be the lesser crisis. The greater crisis had been building, unseen, at inside a financial arrangement so old that almost nobody alive remembered agreeing to it. Chapter 2. The deal nobody was supposed to question. In 1760, King George III signed away a fortune, and in exchange, the British monarchy got something more valuable: the right to never explain itself. The arrangement was elegant. George, newly crowned and deeply in debt, agreed to surrender the revenue from the Crown estate, a vast portfolio of land, property, and resources accumulated over centuries, to the British Treasury. In return, Parliament would pay the monarch a fixed annual sum called the civil list, covering the costs of royal duties and household expenses. On paper, both sides benefited. The Treasury gained a reliable and growing income stream. The Crown gained financial stability and freedom from the indignity of begging Parliament for money every time a roof leaked. But the deal contained a hidden asymmetry that would take 2 centuries to detonate. The Crown estate remained the sovereign's property in law, even though its revenues went to the state. And the palaces, Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, St. James's Palace, were designated occupied royal palaces. They belonged not to the monarch personally, but to the institution of the Crown. The Queen lived in them. The taxpayer maintained them. And neither side examined the arrangement too closely, because to do so would have required answering a question that nobody wanted to ask. Who, exactly, is responsible when the roof falls in? The financial architecture grew more complex over the centuries. By the 20th century, the civil list covered official expenses. A separate grant in aid covered palace maintenance. The monarch's personal wealth, invested in stocks, art, property, and land at Balmoral and Sandringham, was enormous but deliberately opaque. And the most sensitive element of all was taxation. Since the 1930s, British monarchs had paid no income tax. This was not a formal legal exemption. It was a gentleman's agreement, a convention that had hardened into expectation. The monarch's income from the Duchy of Lancaster, which funded personal expenses, went untaxed. Capital gains went untaxed. The vast personal art collection went untaxed. The numbers, when assembled, were staggering. By 1992, the Crown estate generated over £70 million annually for the Treasury. The civil list payment to the Queen was roughly $7.5 million. The grant in aid for palace maintenance varied, but ran to several million more. The Queen's personal fortune was the subject of intense speculation. The Sunday Times Rich List estimated it at over £6 billion, though Buckingham Palace contested this figure vigorously, suggesting it included Crown assets the Queen did not personally own. The true number was unknowable. That was the point. The system functioned on ambiguity. For 2 centuries, this ambiguity held. The public broadly accepted that the monarchy cost money. The crown estate generated more revenue than the monarch consumed. And the average British citizen, asked to describe the financial relationship between queen and country, would have shrugged and said it seemed to work well enough. That was the genius of the arrangement. It survived not because it was fair, but because it was invisible. The vulnerability, though, was always there. The entire structure depended on public goodwill. The moment the public felt that the arrangement was exploitative, the moment they perceived the crown as taking more than it gave, the silence would break. And once it broke, the questions that poured through the gap would be devastating. Why does the Queen not pay tax? Why should the public maintain buildings the Queen lives in but does not own? And if the Queen is so wealthy, why does she need public money at all? In 1986, a fire had gutted Hampton Court Palace. The government paid for the restoration without controversy. The public accepted it because Hampton Court was a museum, because no one lived there, and because the nation's finances were strong. Nobody drew a connection between the public cost of maintaining royal buildings and the private wealth of the monarch. But that was 1986. By 1992, everything had changed. The economy had collapsed, the fairy tale had shattered, and the public was about to receive a bill that would force it to examine an arrangement that had survived only because no one had ever bothered to read the fine print. Chapter 3. The Empire's Living Room at its peak. By the mid-20th century, Windsor Castle was not merely where the monarchy lived, it was the physical proof that the monarchy would last forever. The castle's ceremonial life had reached a level of orchestrated splendor that rivaled anything in its long history. In state banquets in St. George's Hall seated 160 guests at a single horseshoe table stretching nearly 55 meters. Each place setting required 6 glasses, 5 pieces of cutlery, and positioning measured to the millimeter by footmen using rulers. The Waterloo Chamber, commissioned by George IV to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon, displayed portraits of the Allied leaders by Sir Thomas Lawrence. Its table could accommodate 150. Visiting heads of state, from American presidents to Japanese emperors, dined beneath ceilings that declared British power in paint and gold leaf. The royal collection held within Windsor's walls was not merely a private art gallery. It was one of the most significant accumulations of European art in existence. In the print room in the Royal Library housed some 600 drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, the largest single collection of his work anywhere in the world. Holbein portraits hung in corridors. Canalettos lined the walls of rooms where staff walked past them daily without a second glance. The collection included masterworks by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Van Dyck. It contained suits of armor worn at Agincourt. It held clocks collected by George III, hundreds of them, each a miniature marvel of 18th century engineering. The Doll's House, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens and presented to Queen Mary in 1924, was itself a work of art. A 1:12 scale palace with functioning plumbing, electric lights, bottles of real vintage wine in the cellar, and miniature books written by the leading authors of the day. But the castle's significance was not merely material. Windsor held something that no inventory could capture, an emotional bond with the Queen herself. Elizabeth had known the castle since childhood. During the Second World War, when German bombers targeted London and Buckingham Palace was hit 9 times, the young Princess Elizabeth and her sister Margaret were evacuated to Windsor. They sheltered in the castle cellars during air raids. In 1940, at the age of 14, Elizabeth made her first public broadcast from Windsor, addressing the children of the Commonwealth in a voice steady beyond her years. The castle had been her refuge in the most terrifying period of her life. As Queen, she returned to Windsor nearly every weekend. The court moved there for Easter and for a month in the spring. It was at Windsor, and not Buckingham Palace, that Elizabeth felt most at ease. She rode horses in the Great Park. She walked her corgis along the East Terrace. She kept her private apartments in the Upper Ward, simple by royal standards, surrounded by photographs and personal mementos rather than state grandeur. Buckingham Palace was the office. Windsor was home. The castle also served as the physical repository of the monarchy's claim to permanence. St. George's Chapel in the Lower Ward held the tombs of 10 monarchs, including Henry VIII, Charles I, and George VI, the Queen's father. The Order of the Garter, the oldest order of chivalry in the world, held its annual ceremony there. The Round Tower flew the royal standard when the Queen was in residence, and the Union flag when she was not. Each stone, each ceremony, each piece of silver cleaned by gloved hands and placed on linen tablecloths reinforced the same message: the monarchy endures. By the autumn of 1992, this message had become the monarchy's most important asset, because by then, the institution it was built to protect was under siege from a direction no castle wall could defend against. The enemy was not at the gates. It was on the front pages, and before the fire ever touched Windsor's walls, the flames of scandal had already consumed the public's willingness to believe that the crown deserved the benefit of the doubt. The castle still stood, magnificent and seemingly impregnable, but the people inside it were about to discover that the oldest fortress in England could not protect them from the most dangerous force in modern politics: a taxpayer who has stopped feeling grateful. Chapter 4: The Wiring Behind the Walls. Behind the gilded ceilings and the Van Dykes, Windsor Castle was rotting from the inside, and the people responsible for fixing it refused to let anyone look. The problem was infrastructure. Windsor Castle had been built, rebuilt, modified, and extended over 900 years. Its electrical systems reflected that history. Wiring from different decades ran through walls, above ceilings, and along corridors in a tangle that no single engineer fully understood. Some sections of wiring dated back to the early 20th century, installed when electricity was still a novelty and fire safety regulations barely existed. The load on these circuits had grown enormously as modern lighting, heating, and equipment were added to rooms that had originally been lit by candles and warmed by open fires. The castle's 300 fireplaces were themselves a fire risk, but they were a known and managed one. Chimney fires were familiar. Staff understood them. The electrical system was far more dangerous precisely because its dangers were invisible. Wires ran through voids in walls and ceilings, snaking through spaces no engineer had inspected in decades. They passed behind centuries-old oak paneling that would burn like kindling if a spark ever found it. They crossed spaces that had been sealed and forgotten, concealed behind plaster and paint, inaccessible without significant demolition. Insulation on some older cables had degraded. Junction boxes sat in cavities where dust had accumulated for years. The castle was not merely old. It was a building whose internal anatomy was unknown even to the people charged with maintaining it. In the late 1980s, the decision was made to rewire the Upper Ward. The project was enormous. It required emptying rooms of their contents so that workers could access the wiring behind walls. Furniture, paintings, and decorative objects had to be cataloged, removed, and stored. Rooms were stripped bare. The project was slow, expensive, and disruptive to the castle's ceremonial function. By 1992, it was still incomplete, but the rewiring would prove to have an accidental benefit. Because rooms were being emptied for the electrical work, many of Windsor's most valuable contents were already in storage or moved to adjacent spaces when the fire struck. This saved irreplaceable works of art. It was a mercy born of bureaucratic slowness rather than foresight. The castle's fire safety systems were, by modern standards, astonishingly inadequate. There were no sprinklers anywhere in the building, not in the state apartments, not above the irreplaceable art, not in the roof voids where centuries of timber lay exposed. The detection system was rudimentary, relying on older technology that could not distinguish between a genuine fire and a sensor malfunction. The castle relied on a fire brigade of 20 men, but only 6 of those were full-time firefighters. The rest were part-time, called in as needed. Their station was not inside the castle grounds. It was at Slough, over 2 miles away, separated from the castle by town traffic and narrow roads. Response time, even under ideal conditions, was measured in minutes that a fire in a timber-framed building could not afford. The assumption, never formally articulated, but embedded in every decision, every budget allocation, every deferred upgrade, was that a serious fire at Windsor Castle was unlikely. The building was stone after all. 900 years had passed without catastrophe. What could burn? The answer was almost everything inside it. The stone walls were a shell, a fireproof container wrapped around a combustible interior. Within that shell, the castle was a labyrinth of combustible material. Oak beams supported floors and roofs. The paneled walls concealed timber framing. The roof above St. George's Hall, one of the grandest medieval interiors in England, hid a vast void. This space, concealed above a false ceiling, was large enough to drive a coal truck through. It had originally been designed precisely for that purpose, to allow coal to be transported across the upper ward to the various fireplaces without being seen by the royal household. In the event of fire, this void would act as a highway, allowing flames and superheated gases to travel horizontally above the ceiling, out of sight and beyond the reach of firefighters on the floor below. Buckingham Palace, which administered the castle, was protective of its autonomy to the point of obstruction. English Heritage, the government body responsible for advising on the care of historic buildings, was denied permission to carry out a full fire safety survey of the castle during the rewiring project. English Heritage had the expertise. It had the mandate. But the palace regarded its own buildings as its own business. The refusal was polite, bureaucratic, and absolute. This was not malice. It was institutional arrogance of a kind familiar to anyone who has watched a venerable organization resist outside scrutiny. It was the quiet assumption that a system that had worked for centuries would continue to work indefinitely. The fact that the rewiring project itself was evidence that the system was failing, that the castle's electrical infrastructure was so degraded it required wholesale replacement, did not alter this conviction. The palace had managed Windsor for centuries. It would continue to manage Windsor. Outside experts were not required. The castle also contained an elaborate network of service corridors and hidden passageways, built over centuries to allow servants to move through the building without being seen by the royal family or their guests. These corridors connected rooms, wings, and floors in ways that were not always documented on any single plan. Some dated to the medieval period. Others had been added during the Victorian expansion. They created pathways for air movement that would, in a fire, act as chimneys, drawing flames and superheated gases from one area to another with terrifying speed. A fire that began in one corner of the upper ward could, through these concealed routes, reach rooms hundreds of feet away before anyone understood where the flames had gone. There were clear warnings. A fire at Hampton Court Palace in 1986, which destroyed the king's apartments and killed one elderly resident, had demonstrated the vulnerability of historic royal residences with devastating clarity. That fire started in a single room and spread rapidly through concealed voids and timber structures. Firefighters arrived to find flames racing above ceilings and behind walls, following paths that no floor plan could predict. The restoration took 6 years and cost £12 million. Hampton Court should have prompted an urgent, comprehensive review of fire safety at every occupied royal palace in the country. It did prompt some improvements. Smoke detectors were added in some areas. Evacuation procedures were reviewed. But at Windsor, the sheer scale of the building, the complexity of the work required, the disruption to the Queen's personal residence, and the institutional resistance to outside interference all combined to ensure that the most critical upgrades had not been completed by the autumn of 1992. By November of that year, the rewiring project had reached the northeast corner of the upper ward. Workers were using high-powered lights to illuminate their work in the Queen's private chapel, a small room whose walls were covered with historic textiles. The lights burned hot, the curtains hung close, and the fire detection system in that section of the castle was not yet connected to the new wiring. The castle was a masterpiece of 9 centuries of craftsmanship. It was also, in its concealed spaces and neglected systems, a fire waiting to happen. The only question was when. The answer was the 20th of November, the Queen's 45th wedding anniversary. Chapter 5. The year the fairy tale died. Before the first flame touched Windsor Castle, 1992 had already done more damage to the monarchy than any year since the abdication crisis. The year began with a photograph. In January, pictures surfaced of the Duchess of York, Sarah Ferguson, on holiday in Morocco with Steve Wyatt, a Texan oil heir. The photograph showed nothing technically scandalous, but the intimacy of the images and the absence of Prince Andrew made the implication unmistakable. The tabloids, which had spent years alternately celebrating and savaging the younger royals, had their first blood of the year. It would not be the last. In March, Buckingham Palace announced the separation of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. The statement was brief and formal. The tabloid coverage was neither. Ferguson had become a figure of relentless mockery. Her weight, her spending, her taste in friends, all weaponized by a press that had once adored her. The separation was treated not as a private tragedy, but as public entertainment. The message to the watching public was unmistakable. The royal family was no different from any other dysfunctional household, except that this one was funded by the state. April brought Princess Anne's divorce from Captain Mark Phillips, only the second royal divorce since Henry VIII's time. The decree was granted quietly, but it added to the cumulative impression of an institution in crisis. The 3 of the Queen's 4 children had now seen their marriages fail or fracture in public. The fairy tale that the 1981 wedding of Charles and Diana had seemed to promise was dead. Then, in June, Andrew Morton published a book that detonated like a bomb in the heart of the monarchy. Diana. Her true story portrayed the Princess of Wales as a woman driven to bulimia, self-harm, and despair by a cold and unfaithful husband. It revealed Charles's long relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. It described Diana's isolation within the royal family, the loneliness of a young woman trapped inside an institution that valued duty over compassion and image over truth. And although Diana's direct cooperation with Morton was initially denied, and the truth soon became apparent, the princess had authorized friends to speak on her behalf and had provided material herself. She had, in effect, gone to war against her own household. The book sold millions of copies within weeks of publication. It was serialized in the Sunday Times. It dominated every front page, every television bulletin, every conversation in every office and pub in the country. It reframed the public's understanding of the royal marriage overnight. Charles was no longer merely distant. He was cruel. Diana was no longer merely glamorous. She was a victim. The fairy tale wedding of 1981, watched by 750 million people around the world, was revealed as the beginning of a nightmare. The public, which had invested enormous emotional capital in Diana, felt betrayed not by her, but on her behalf. The summer offered no respite. In August, photographs were published showing Sarah Ferguson having her toes kissed by her financial advisor, John Bryan, while on holiday in the south of France. The images were taken with a long lens. They showed Ferguson lying by a pool, Bryan crouched at her feet. The Queen was at Balmoral with the family when the pictures appeared in the Daily Mirror. Accounts from those present describe a breakfast table in frozen silence, the newspaper spread open, and Ferguson sitting in visible distress. The photographs were humiliating not merely for Ferguson, but for the institution. They suggested a royal court that had lost all control of its own members, and, worse, that its members no longer cared. Meanwhile, transcripts of intercepted telephone calls were circulating. The Squidgygate tapes, recorded in 1989 but published in August 1992, captured a conversation between Diana and her friend James Gilby. The conversation was intimate. Gilby called her Squidgy repeatedly. The implications were damaging enough. But the Camillagate tapes, recorded around the same period and published in January 1993, were far worse. They captured an explicit conversation between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. The content was so graphic, so startlingly undignified, that newspapers debated whether to print the full transcript. Many did. The heir to the throne was exposed in the most humiliating manner imaginable. All of this played out against a backdrop of genuine economic hardship that gave the public's anger a sharp and personal edge. Britain was deep in the longest recession since the 1930s. Unemployment had risen above 3 million. House prices had collapsed by as much as 30% in some areas, trapping hundreds of thousands of homeowners in negative equity. Families who had bought homes during the boom of the late 80s now owed more than their properties were worth. Repossessions were running at $75,000 a year. Interest rates, which had been raised to defend the pound's position in the European exchange rate mechanism, crushed businesses and households alike. Small businesses failed by the tens of thousands. On the 16th of September, 1992, Black Wednesday forced Britain's humiliating exit from the ERM, costing the Treasury an estimated £3.3 billion in a single day. The government's economic credibility was destroyed. The Chancellor, Norman Lamont, was photographed singing in the bath. The contrast between the political class and the people it governed could not have been starker. In Parliament, the mood toward the monarchy was shifting. Dennis Skinner, the Labour MP for Bolsover, known for his blunt contempt for privilege, had been needling the institution for years. But by the autumn of 1992, his criticisms no longer sounded radical. They sounded mainstream. Why should an immensely wealthy family receive public money? Why should its members be exempt from the taxes that ordinary people paid? And why should their marital disasters be treated as national tragedies when millions of Britons were losing their homes? The public's reservoir of sympathy for the royal family, never as deep as the palace assumed, was drained. The scandals had stripped away the mystique. The recession had stripped away the tolerance. By November, the average British citizen was not in the mood to extend the benefit of the doubt to anyone, least of all a family that appeared to be living in extraordinary luxury while the country suffered. It was into this atmosphere, toxic with resentment, exhaustion, and disillusionment, that a single spark fell. Chapter 6. 30 feet of curtain and 1,000-watt light. At 11:15 on the morning of the 20th of November, 1992, a spotlight overheated beside a curtain in the Queen's private chapel, and 1,000 years of unquestioned privilege began to burn. The private chapel was a small room in the northeast corner of the upper ward. Its walls were hung with heavy curtains and historic textiles. As part of the ongoing rewiring project, high-powered halogen spotlights had been set up to illuminate the work area. One of these lights, rated at approximately 1,000 watts, stood close to a 30-foot curtain. Whether the light was left unattended, or whether the curtain shifted closer to the bulb, or whether a combination of heat buildup and proximity created the ignition, the exact trigger remains uncertain. What is certain is that the curtain caught fire. The flames were discovered at approximately 11:15. A member of staff spotted the fire and raised the alarm. The castle's internal fire team responded quickly, but within minutes, it became clear that this was beyond their capacity. The fire had already spread from the curtain to the surrounding furnishings and was climbing the walls of the chapel. The heat was intense. The chapel was a box of combustible material, textiles, timber, painted plaster, all feeding the flames. The fire found the ceiling void. This was the moment that transformed a serious room fire into a catastrophe. Above the ornate ceiling of the private chapel and extending across the roofs of the state apartments lay the concealed space that had once served as a route for coal trucks. This void was vast, unsprinklered, and filled with centuries-old timber. Once the fire broke through the chapel ceiling and entered this space, it could travel horizontally, above the ceilings and out of sight, spreading to room after room before anyone on the floor below knew it was there. The local fire brigade arrived within minutes. Then more appliances from surrounding counties. Then more still. The fire was running through the roof void above St. George's Hall, the grandest of the state apartments, a room 180 feet long with an ornate ceiling that masked the inferno above it. Firefighters on the ground could hear the roar, but could not reach the fire. The ceiling was too high. The access points were too few. The void was too large. By early afternoon, St. George's Hall was fully ablaze. The ceiling collapsed. The medieval timbers, some dating back to the 14th century, it burned with a ferocity that generated temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Flames erupted from the roof, visible for miles. The smoke could be seen from London. Outside, a scene of extraordinary organized chaos unfolded. Castle staff, soldiers, police officers, and volunteers formed a human chain to evacuate the contents of the threatened rooms. Over 470 people joined the effort. They carried paintings off walls, lifted display cases, rolled carpets, and dismantled furniture. The Waterloo Chambers dining table, 150 feet long and far too heavy to carry in one piece, was disassembled and passed down the chain in sections. Clocks collected by George III, over 300 of them, were wrapped and removed. But paintings by Rubens and Van Dyck were taken from their frames and passed hand over hand through smoke-filled corridors. The salvage operation saved an incalculable quantity of art and furnishing. Much of it was already out of the fire's path, thanks to the ongoing rewiring work that had required rooms to be emptied. But the human chain saved items that would otherwise have been lost. It was an act of collective devotion that transcended any question of who owned what. Soldiers in uniform worked alongside curators in tweed. Staff who had spent careers polishing silver now carried it through choking smoke to waiting trucks. People passed priceless objects hand over hand, not because they had been ordered to, but because something deep in them understood that these things mattered. They were saving not just art, but memory. Not just furniture, but history. As the afternoon wore on, the fire intensified. The flames found room after room in the upper ward, racing through interconnected spaces with a speed that stunned experienced firefighters. The Brunswick Tower, the Star Building, and the corridors connecting the state apartments all came under assault. The heat was so intense that lead on the castle's roof melted and ran in streams down the ancient stonework. Windows shattered, timber crashed. The sound, according to those who were there, was like a continuous roar, punctuated by the crack of collapsing beams and the hiss of water hitting superheated stone. The fire burned for 15 hours. At its peak, 39 fire appliances were on the scene, and 225 firefighters were engaged. 1.5 million gallons of water were poured onto the blaze. The water itself caused enormous damage, soaking through floors and walls and pooling in rooms below the fire, warping wood, staining plaster, and saturating fabrics that had survived 3 centuries of careful conservation. The combination of fire, heat, smoke, and water destroyed 9 principal staterooms entirely and damaged a further 115 rooms to varying degrees. The total affected area covered approximately 9,000 square meters, roughly 1/5 of the castle's total floor space. Prince Andrew was at the castle when the fire began. He helped coordinate the early evacuation effort, directing staff and carrying objects himself. He telephoned his mother, who was at Buckingham Palace. The Queen arrived at Windsor in the afternoon and was driven through the gates to survey the damage. Photographs from that day show her standing in a dark headscarf and a belted raincoat, watching the flames consume her home. Her expression is controlled but unmistakable. The set of her mouth, the stillness of her posture, the way she stood apart from the people around her. This was not a political crisis. This was personal. Windsor was the place she loved most, the place where she had sheltered from bombs as a child, the place where she rode every weekend, and it was burning. By nightfall, the fire was under control, but not extinguished. Firefighters would continue to damp down hotspots for days. The upper ward's roofline was broken. Charred timbers jutted against the November sky. Water streamed from blackened windows. The castle that had stood for 9 centuries looked, for the first time in its history, mortal. No one had died. No one was seriously injured. The art losses, while painful, were far smaller than they might have been. By any measure, the outcome could have been catastrophically worse. But the worst was not the fire. The worst was what happened 72 hours later, when a government minister stood up in the House of Commons and uttered a sentence that would do more damage to the monarchy than any flame. Chapter 7. The 3-day mistake that changed everything. The fire destroyed 1/5 of Windsor Castle, but it was a politician's mouth that nearly destroyed the monarchy. On the 23rd of November, 1992, 3 days after the fire, Peter Brooke, the Secretary of State for National Heritage, arose in the House of Commons. His statement was brief. The government, he announced, would meet the full cost of restoring Windsor Castle from public funds. The castle was, after all, a national treasure. It was an occupied royal palace. It belonged to the state. The government had a duty to repair it. The logic was impeccable. The politics were catastrophic. Within hours, the public response overwhelmed every expectation. A radio phone-in on the BBC attracted calls running 90% against taxpayer funding. The numbers were not close. They were a landslide of anger. Callers did not merely disagree with the decision, they were furious. They cited their own mortgage payments, their own insurance premiums, their own struggle to make ends meet during the worst recession in a generation. If their house caught fire, they said, the government would not pay to rebuild it. Why should the Queen be different? The press, which had spent a year publishing royal scandals with barely concealed glee, now had a new angle. Editorials in papers across the political spectrum questioned the fairness of the arrangement. The Daily Mail, traditionally a defender of the monarchy, expressed reservations. The Sun was blunt. The Independent was analytical. The Guardian was withering. For the first time in the modern era, the financial relationship between crown and country was being examined in public, in detail, and with hostility. The crystallizing question was simple and devastating. If Windsor Castle belongs to the nation, and the Queen merely lives in it, why does she not pay income tax? The two issues, the repair bill and the tax exemption, were technically separate, but in the public mind, they merged into a single, intolerable injustice. The monarch was the wealthiest woman in England. She had not paid income tax in 60 years, and now the government was asking ordinary taxpayers, many of whom were losing their jobs and their homes, to pay £37 million to repair her residence. The comparison to Hampton Court was instructive. 6 years earlier, a fire at Hampton Court had destroyed the king's apartments. The government paid for the £12 million restoration without significant public complaint. The building was a public museum. No one lived in it. The economy was strong. The monarchy was popular. Every condition that had made the Hampton Court payment acceptable was now absent. The deeper issue was consent. For centuries, the British public had consented, implicitly and without being asked, to a financial arrangement that privileged the crown. They had accepted that the monarch did not pay tax. They had accepted that the state maintained the palaces. They had accepted that the civil list funded royal life. This consent was never formally given. It was simply assumed based on tradition, on deference, and on the vague understanding that the monarchy brought in more than it cost. But consent that has never been examined is not really consent at all. It is habit, and habits can break. The fire broke this one, not the fire alone. The scandals had eroded deference. The recession had eroded tolerance. Diana's revelations had eroded sympathy, but the fire provided the moment, the precise, visible, quantifiable moment when the public was presented with a bill and asked to pay it. Now, and in that moment, the accumulated weight of a year's worth of grievances collapsed onto a single point. Members of Parliament sensed the shift. Questions were tabled. Debates were called. Politicians who had never challenged the royal finances found themselves under pressure from constituents who wanted to know why the Queen was exempt from the rules that governed everyone else. The issue transcended party lines. Conservative voters, traditionally monarchist, were as angry as Labour supporters. The complaint was not ideological, it was personal. People felt cheated. They felt that they had been patient through a year of royal embarrassment, and now they were being asked to pay for the privilege. The tabloid press, which had spent a year dismantling the fairy tale, now had its most potent weapon yet: the fire, the bill, and the tax exemption gave every editor a story that wrote itself. Ordinary taxpayers struggling through a recession were being asked to fund the repairs of a building inhabited by a woman whose wealth was estimated in the hundreds of millions. Columnists competed to express the public's fury with the sharpest phrase. The Sun ran the headline: "When the castle caught fire, one was not amused. Now, one wants the taxpayer to pick up the bill. One is not amused either." The Daily Mirror asked its readers directly whether they should pay. The response was overwhelming. The numbers varied by poll, but the direction was unanimous. The public said no. Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, the mood was close to panic. The scale of the backlash had not been anticipated. Not by the palace, not by Downing Street, not by Peter Brook or his advisors at the Heritage Department. Their assumption, shared across government and court, was that the public would respond to the fire with sympathy. Windsor Castle was a beloved national symbol. It had been damaged. Of course, the government would help. The miscalculation was total. The public did not respond with sympathy. The public responded with a question, and the question, once asked, could not be unasked. It hung in the air like smoke. Why should we pay for the Queen's house when the Queen will not pay tax like the rest of us? The Queen had 4 days to respond. She was already scheduled to speak at a lunch at the Guildhall on the 24th of November, celebrating the 40th anniversary of her accession. The speech had been planned as a routine ceremonial event. It was about to become the most significant public statement by a British monarch in decades. She arrived with a cold, a sore throat, and the knowledge that everything she said would be measured against the anger of a nation that, for the first time in her reign, was questioning whether the crown was worth the cost. Chapter 8. A Queen Stripped of Her Armor. 4 days after her home burned, Queen Elizabeth stood at a podium with a cold, a cracking voice, and the closest thing to a public apology a British monarch had made in living memory. The date was the 24th of November, 1992. The setting was the Guildhall in the City of London. The occasion was a luncheon hosted by the Lord Mayor to mark the 40th anniversary of the Queen's accession to the throne. The guest list included senior politicians, diplomats, and city grandees. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a celebration. A sovereign reaching 40 years on the throne was a milestone worthy of toasts and ceremony. But there was nothing normal about November 1992. The Queen rose to speak. Her voice was hoarse. A heavy cold had settled in her chest. She wore a dark outfit. Her expression was composed, but those who knew her well detected something unfamiliar beneath the composure: exhaustion. She began by acknowledging the cold, noting that her doctor had told her it was not possible to convey good wishes at a distance. Then she turned to the subject that everyone in the room was waiting to hear addressed. She said that 1992 was not a year on which she would look back with undiluted pleasure. She described it, though using a phrase suggested to her by her former private secretary, Sir Edward Ford, as an Annus Horribilis. The phrase was instantly famous. Latin for horrible year, it was an unmistakable echo of the Queen's own description of 1977, her silver jubilee, as an Annus Mirabilis, a wonderful year. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. This was not a sovereign offering platitudes. This was a woman admitting, in public, that her year had been a disaster. She went further. She acknowledged that no institution should expect to be free from scrutiny. She suggested that scrutiny, if carried out with a touch of gentleness, was good for institutions as well as individuals. She acknowledged that history would be the final judge of how the events of the year were assessed, and she expressed the hope that the public would show some understanding. There was no anger in her words, no defensiveness, no attempt to deflect blame or claim victimhood. The tone was measured, reflective, almost philosophical. It was unlike anything the Queen had ever said in public. The speech was remarkable for what it did not do as much as for what it did. The Queen did not apologize. A British sovereign does not apologize. The constitutional position does not allow it, and Elizabeth's own temperament would never have permitted it. But she came as close to apology as the institution and the woman permitted. She acknowledged failure. She acknowledged pain. She acknowledged, in language that was careful but unmistakable, that the monarchy existed within a social contract, and that the terms of that contract were subject to renegotiation. For a monarch who had spent 40 years embodying stability, continuity, and silence, this was an act of extraordinary vulnerability. Her voice cracked at several points. Whether from the cold or from emotion, the effect was the same. Television cameras captured each falter. The footage played on every evening news bulletin. This was not the composed, distant sovereign of official portraits and state occasions. This was a 66-year-old woman whose children's marriages had collapsed in public, whose daughter-in-law had declared war on the institution, whose reputation had been battered by a press she could not control, and whose home was still smoldering 4 days after the worst fire in its history. The vulnerability was visible. It was, by the standards of Elizabeth's 40-year reign, unprecedented. The reaction was complex and divided. Many commentators praised the speech as a masterpiece of restrained candor. The phrase Annus Horribilis entered the language permanently, joining the small vocabulary of royal utterances that become common currency. The image of the Queen, her voice breaking, admitting that the year had been terrible, generated a wave of sympathy that partially offset the anger over the fire and the tax issue. For a moment, the public remembered that behind the institution was a person. Letters of sympathy arrived at the palace. Flowers appeared at the gates of Windsor. The tide of hostility paused briefly to allow compassion through. But sympathy was not enough. The anger over the repair bill and the tax exemption had not dissipated. It had merely been paused. Compassion for the Queen as a person did not translate into acceptance of the Queen as a tax-exempt landlord. The Guildhall speech was a holding action, not a solution. The fundamental question remained: would the Queen pay income tax? Would the financial arrangements that had governed the monarchy for 2 centuries be reformed? The speech had bought time. It had not answered the question. 2 weeks after the Guildhall speech, on the 9th of December, Prime Minister John Major announced in the House of Commons that Prince Charles and Princess Diana had formally separated. The announcement was received with weary resignation rather than shock. After Morton's book, the Squidgygate tapes, and months of visible animosity, the only surprise was that it had taken this long. But it confirmed, if confirmation were needed, that the monarchy's Annus Horribilis was not merely a bad year. It was the end of an era. The monarchy's approval ratings fell to their lowest point in modern polling. Surveys showed a majority of the British public questioning whether the institution was worth its cost. Republican sentiment, always marginal in Britain, reached levels not seen since the Victorian era. The question was no longer whether the monarchy would survive in its current form. The question was whether it would survive at all. The answer, when it came, would not be delivered in a speech. It would be delivered in a tax return. Chapter 9. The Price of Survival. The Queen did not volunteer to pay income tax. The British public gave her no choice, and everyone involved understood the difference. The negotiations began behind closed doors in the weeks following the Guildhall speech. The palace, the treasury, and the Prime Minister's office engaged in discussions that were unprecedented in scope and sensitivity. At stake was not merely a financial arrangement, but a constitutional principle, the relationship between the sovereign and the state's revenue system. On the 26th of February, 1993, the palace announced that the Queen had agreed to pay income tax on her personal income, effective from the 6th of April, 93. She would pay tax on income from the Duchy of Lancaster, which funded her private expenditure, and on investment income. She would also pay capital gains tax on assets she sold, though not on assets she passed to her successor, preserving the principle that the Crown's accumulated wealth should not be diminished by each succession. It was the first time a British monarch had paid income tax since the 1930s. The announcement was carefully framed as a voluntary decision. The palace insisted that discussions had been underway before the fire, that this was not a response to public pressure, but the culmination of a review initiated by the Queen herself. This framing was technically true. Preliminary conversations about the tax position had begun in early 1992, but nobody, inside or outside the palace, seriously believed that the timing was coincidental. The fire, the backlash, and the public fury had accelerated a process that might otherwise have taken years, or might never have happened at all. The tax agreement was accompanied by a broader package of financial reforms. The civil list, which had funded the official expenses of several members of the royal family, was reduced. The Queen agreed to reimburse the Treasury for the civil list payments made to all family members except herself and the Duke of Edinburgh. This effectively meant that junior royals would be funded by the Queen personally rather than by the taxpayer. The restoration of Windsor Castle was funded through a combination of sources designed to minimize the political damage and demonstrate that the monarchy was willing to bear the cost of its own misfortune. Buckingham Palace was opened to paying visitors for the first time in its history. The doors opened in August 1993. Tickets were priced at £8. Visitors queued around the block. They walked through the state rooms, the throne room, the picture gallery, and the gardens. They saw how the Queen lived. Or rather, they saw the ceremonial version of how the Queen lived, since the palace opened only during August and September when the royal family was at Balmoral. The revenue went directly to the Windsor Restoration Fund. It was a profound symbolic shift. The most famous royal residence in the world, the seat of monarchical power and privacy, was turned into a tourist attraction to pay for the repair of another palace. The message was unmistakable. The public would be allowed in because the public had demanded it. Privacy, the commodity the monarchy had guarded most fiercely, was the price of the ticket. Windsor Castle's precincts were also open to paying visitors, with admission charges applied for the first time. The Queen contributed approximately £2 million from her personal funds. Additional money came from the Coutts Charitable Trust and other private sources. The target was to fund the entire restoration without a single pound of new taxpayer money. It was a direct response to the public revolt of November. The palace had heard the message. It had not enjoyed hearing it, but it had heard it. Beyond the financial specifics, the crisis prompted a deeper institutional rethinking that extended far beyond the question of who paid for the castle. The Queen convened what became known as the Way Ahead Group, an informal committee including senior royals and their advisors, which met for the first time in September 1992, before the fire, but whose agenda was dramatically expanded by it. Its purpose was to examine how the monarchy could modernize to maintain public support in an age that no longer granted deference automatically. Topics included the role of junior royals, the cost of the institution, its media strategy, its relationship with the press, and its engagement with the broader public. The group met regularly through the 1990s and beyond, producing incremental reforms that, taken together, represented the most significant shift in how the monarchy presented itself since the introduction of the Christmas broadcast. The total package amounted to a constitutional adjustment achieved without legislation, without a referendum, and without a formal parliamentary debate. It was done through announcement, agreement, and the quiet pressure of public opinion translated into political action. The Old Compact, in which the Crown received public money and tax exemption in return for the Crown Estate's revenues and the monarch's symbolic service, was not abolished. It was revised. The revision was driven not by principle, but by necessity. The monarchy paid tax not because it was the right thing to do, but because refusing to do so had become politically impossible. This distinction mattered. It preserved the monarchy's dignity while conceding the substance. The Queen was not humiliated. She was not forced. She agreed, voluntarily, to a change that everyone knew she had resisted for years. The fiction of voluntariness was essential. It allowed the institution to adapt without appearing to submit, and it allowed the public to feel that their anger had been heard without requiring anyone to admit that the old arrangement had been fundamentally unfair. The Old Compact was dead. But the institution that had lived under it for 2 centuries was still standing. The question now was whether the physical embodiment of that institution, the castle itself, could be saved. Chapter 10. 5 years, £36 million, and a new roof. The architects faced a question no amount of money could answer. Do you rebuild what burned, or do you admit that what replaces it might be better? The restoration of Windsor Castle began in earnest in 1993, overseen by a committee chaired by Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. The architectural firm Donald Insall Associates, specialists in historic building conservation, and led the project. Their brief was immense: repair or reconstruct over 100 rooms, including 9 principal state apartments, while maintaining the castle's historical integrity and improving its fire safety to modern standards. The philosophical question at the heart of the project was whether to replicate what had been lost or to create something new. For some rooms, the answer was clear. Where detailed photographic and documentary records existed, and where the original design was of significant historical merit, faithful restoration was chosen. The Crimson Drawing Room, the State Dining Room, and the Green Drawing Room were meticulously reconstructed using traditional materials and techniques. But for St. George's Hall and the private chapel, the committee chose a different path. And St. George's Hall's Victorian ceiling had been a 19th century interpretation of a medieval original. Rather than reproduce a reproduction, the architects designed a new hammer beam roof of green English oak, the largest green oak structure built since the Middle Ages. The timbers were sourced from sustainable forests across England. The roof was a modern masterpiece that honored the medieval tradition while being unmistakably new. It would settle and darken with age, the oak shrinking and hardening over decades, becoming more beautiful as it matured. The private chapel, where the fire had started, was not rebuilt. In its place, architect Giles Downes designed the lantern lobby, an octagonal vestibule topped by a fan vault and a lantern that flooded the space with natural light. It was deliberately modern, a room that acknowledged the fire rather than pretending it had never happened. The fire safety improvements were comprehensive. Over 550 new fire detectors were installed throughout the castle. A dedicated fire station was built within the castle grounds. Fire compartmentalization was improved. Sprinkler systems were installed in the most vulnerable areas. The concealed voids that had allowed the fire to travel unseen through the roof were sealed and divided into sections. The project took 5 years. It employed over 1,000 craftspeople, stonemasons, woodcarvers, gilders, painters, plasterers, and specialists in techniques that had not been widely practiced for generations. Young apprentices trained alongside master craftsmen. Medieval woodworking methods were revived. Yet the gold leaf was applied by hand to surfaces that would have taken a machine a fraction of the time, but none of the quality. The project became, inadvertently, one of the largest training exercises in traditional building crafts that Britain had undertaken in the 20th century. The final cost was £36.5 million, well under the original estimate of £60 million. The savings were achieved through efficient project management, competitive tendering, and the revenue generated by opening Buckingham Palace and Windsor to visitors. The restoration was completed on the 20th of November, 1997, exactly 5 years to the day after the fire. The date also marked the Queen and Prince Philip's 50th wedding anniversary. The symmetry was deliberate. The castle that had nearly broken the monarchy on a November day was now restored on a November day, and the anniversary that the fire had overshadowed was finally celebrated. The result was a castle that was, in several respects, superior to what had existed before. The new St. George's Hall roof was more architecturally distinguished than its predecessor. The fire safety systems were incomparably better. The restored rooms incorporated modern environmental controls that would protect their contents for generations. The project was hailed as a triumph of conservation, a demonstration that historic buildings could be repaired with sensitivity, ambition, and fiscal discipline. But the greatest achievement of the restoration was not architectural, it was political. By funding the project without new taxpayer money, the monarchy had answered the public's challenge. The receipt that had nearly brought down the institution was paid, and the building that had exposed the crown's vulnerability was once again whole. Chapter 11. What the fire could not reach. The flames stopped where the fire break held, and on the other side, Leonardo da Vinci's drawings waited in the dark, untouched. The fire's destruction, while severe, was far less total than it might have been. The geography of Windsor Castle, divided into the upper ward, the lower ward, and the round tower on its central mound, provided natural barriers that contained the blaze. The fire burned through the northeast corner of the upper ward. It did not reach the lower ward, where St. George's Chapel stood unharmed, its medieval fan vaulting, its stained glass, and its royal tombs entirely unaffected. It did not reach the round tower, where the royal library held its treasure. The Leonardo drawings, the Holbein portraits, the prints and maps and manuscripts accumulated over 5 centuries. The rewiring project that had been underway at the time of the fire proved to be an inadvertent savior. Rooms in the path of the blaze had been emptied of their contents to allow electrical work to proceed. Paintings had been removed from walls. Furniture had been cataloged and placed in storage. Decorative objects had been wrapped and relocated. When the fire swept through these rooms, it consumed architecture, but not contents. The physical fabric of the building suffered terribly. The works of art within it, in many cases, survived because they were already somewhere else. The human chain that formed during the fire saved additional works that had not been moved for the rewiring. The speed and organization of the evacuation was remarkable. Paintings by Rubens and Van Dyck were passed hand over hand through corridors filling with smoke. The great table from the Waterloo chamber was disassembled and carried to safety. Clocks, miniatures, porcelain, silverware, all were removed by a chain of people working with extraordinary composure under extreme conditions. No major work of art was lost to the fire itself. The losses that did occur were primarily architectural: ceilings, paneling, fixtures, and decorative plasterwork that could not be moved. Among the few notable losses was a large portrait by Sir William Beechey of King George III reviewing troops. The painting was enormous, one of the largest canvases in the royal collection, and it carried a strange historical footnote. George III himself had once ordered it destroyed, displeased with the likeness. The order was never carried out. Courtiers quietly preserved the painting, and it hung in the castle for 2 centuries, surviving the king's madness, 2 world wars, and decades of routine conservation. It survived everything except the 20th of November, 1992. The portrait was consumed by the flames that its intended destruction had never produced. It was a detail almost too apt for fiction, a painting that a mad king wanted burned, finally burned by accident rather than by decree, 200 years late. Other losses included decorative plasterwork in the grand reception room, sections of ornate ceiling in the state dining room, and the entire interior of the private chapel where the fire had begun. A sideboard designed by Augustus Pugin was destroyed. Several pieces of furniture dating to the reign of George IV were damaged beyond repair. But measured against the scale of the collection, the losses were remarkably contained. The castle held tens of thousands of objects. Fewer than a dozen significant works were destroyed. In the years following the restoration, a stained glass window was commissioned for the new lantern lobby. Designed by Joseph Nutkins, the window depicts scenes from the fire and the restoration in vivid color. Firefighters appear alongside images of St. George slaying the dragon, the smoke of the fire blending with the smoke of battle. The castle's towers rise from flames into clear sky. It is a memorial that does not mourn. It celebrates survival, courage, and renewal. The fire is remembered not as a catastrophe, but as a passage, a trial through which the castle and the institution it shelters passed and emerged transformed. The full accounting of what survived and what was lost took years to complete. The Royal Collection Trust conducted a detailed inventory in the years following the fire. The conclusion was clear. The material losses, while real, were a fraction of what they might have been. The castle's contents were largely saved. Its architecture was restored. The true cost of the fire was not measured in paintings or paneling. It was measured in something far harder to quantify: the end of an illusion. Chapter 12. The Fortress That Learned to Bend. 2. Windsor Castle stands today because a nation demanded something no English monarch had conceded in centuries. Proof that the crown serves the people, not the other way around. Under King Charles III, the castle continues to function as a working royal residence, a ceremonial center, and a tourist destination. The royal standard flies when the sovereign is present. The Union flag flies when he is not. The state apartments are open to visitors for much of the year. The revenue they generate, along with income from Buckingham Palace tours and other commercial activities, has become a permanent feature of the royal finances. The financial framework that governs the monarchy has been reformed beyond recognition since 1992. The Sovereign Grant Act of 2011 replaced the civil list with a transparent, formula-based funding mechanism tied to the revenue of the Crown estate. The sovereign receives a fixed percentage of the estate's net income. The percentage has varied, rising temporarily to fund the refurbishment of Buckingham Palace. But the principle of transparency, the idea that the public has the right to know what the monarchy costs and what it generates, is now embedded in law. The Crown Estate itself has grown enormously. Valued at approximately £15.5 billion, it encompasses central London property, offshore wind farms, rural estates, and commercial developments. Its annual revenue to the Treasury exceeds £300 million. By any financial measure, the arrangement remains favorable to the state. The Crown Estate generates far more than the monarchy consumes. But the public no longer takes this on trust. The numbers are published. The accounts are audited. The deal that George III struck in 1760 now operates in a transparency that he would have found incomprehensible. The monarchy's relationship with public opinion has become its central preoccupation. The Way Ahead Group, convened in the aftermath of the fire, set the template for a more responsive and self-aware institution. Royal tours are planned with media strategy in mind. Charitable work is emphasized. The younger generation of royals are presented as working members of a national institution, rather than as privileged inhabitants of an ancient court. The approach is imperfect and frequently contested. But the underlying principle that the monarchy must justify its existence to each new generation is no longer disputed. Windsor Castle itself embodies this negotiation. Its ancient walls carry 9 centuries of history. Its restored rooms blend medieval craftsmanship with modern conservation. The new hammer beam roof of St. George's Hall is both a tribute to tradition and a rejection of mere imitation. The lantern lobby, where the private chapel once stood, makes no attempt to conceal the fact that something was lost and something new was made in its place. The building tells the truth about itself in a way it never did before. The fire of 1992 did not threaten to destroy the monarchy because it damaged a building. It threatened to destroy the monarchy because it exposed a financial arrangement that could not survive public scrutiny. The curtain that caught fire beside a spotlight was an accident, but the crisis that followed was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of an institution that had confused tradition with entitlement, silence with consent, and permanence with the right to never change. The paradox is this: the fire that seemed to threaten the monarchy's survival may have been the thing that saved it. Not because it generated sympathy, though it did. Not because it prompted reform, though it did that too. But because it forced an honesty that the institution would never have chosen on its own. The crown agreed to pay tax. The palaces opened their doors. The finances were made public. The mystique was diminished, but the institution endured. No building lasts forever. No institution survives on symbolism once the public sees the bill. Windsor Castle stands today not because it was built to endure. It stands because, in the worst year of the worst decade the modern monarchy had ever faced, it was forced to do the one thing its builders never imagined: prove that it was worth the cost of keeping. The fortress learned to bend. And that is why it did not break.